I had been looking forward to this weekend alone in the cabin. After months of stress at work and dealing with daily life in the city, I needed some quiet time to just relax. I rented a small cabin in the woods, far from any town, where I knew I could be alone with my thoughts. I arrived late in the afternoon, and the sun was already starting to set by the time I settled in. The cabin was cozy and rustic, with a fireplace and a few old, wooden chairs. It was exactly what I needed. After I unpacked, I made a fire and poured myself a drink, enjoying the warmth and silence. I sat in one of the old chairs, feeling the tension slowly melt away. But then, out of nowhere, there was a loud knock on the door. I jumped, my heart racing. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, and my phone had lost service more than an hour ago. I wasn't expecting visitors, and it seemed strange that someone would be out here. I stayed still for a moment, wondering if I had imagined it, but then the knock came again, louder this time. Cautiously, I walked to the door, peeking through a small crack in the curtain. There, in the fading light, stood a man. He looked rough, with a thick, muddy jacket and a hood that covered most of his face. I hesitated, not sure if I should open the door, but I figured he might just need help or directions. When I finally opened the door a crack, I asked, "Can I help you?" He mumbled something that I could barely understand. His voice was low and raspy, almost like he hadn't spoken in a long time. I leaned in, trying to make sense of his words, and finally caught that he was asking for directions. I told him the main road was about a mile back, hoping he would just thank me and leave. But instead, he kept shifting his feet and looking past me, as if he was trying to see inside the cabin. His eyes were cold and empty, and his presence felt unsettling. After a few tense moments, he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I closed the door quickly and locked it, my heart pounding. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself he was just a lost hiker. But as the night went on, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up or planning something. Later, as I lay in bed, I started to hear soft, crunching sounds outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but then I realized the sound was too deliberate, too steady, like footsteps on gravel. I held my breath, listening closely. The footsteps moved slowly around the cabin, stopping just outside my bedroom window. I lay there, frozen with fear, afraid to look, afraid to confirm that he was out there. My mind raced with horrible thoughts. I considered calling for help, but there was no service and I was alone. I kept telling myself he would go away, that he was just passing by. But he stayed outside my window, not moving, just standing there. I don't know how long I lay like that, barely breathing, too scared to make a sound. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I fell into a restless sleep, hoping it was all over. When I woke up the next morning, I was still shaken but relieved to see the light of day. I cautiously walked outside, and as I looked around, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They stopped at each window, including my bedroom window, like he had been watching me the whole time. It was then that I realized how lucky I was that he hadn't tried to break in. I packed my things and left the cabin that morning, not daring to look back. I'll never forget those footsteps or the feeling of being watched by someone lurking just outside. My friends and I had been planning a weekend getaway for months. We all lived in the city, and we wanted a break from the noise, the traffic, and the stress. So, we decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend of hiking, grilling, and just relaxing. There were 5 of us, me, Sarah, Tom, Lisa, and John, and we were excited to finally get some peace and quiet. We arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon. It was perfect, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees with no one around for miles. We unloaded the car, brought in our food, drinks, and supplies, and set up inside. The cabin had everything we needed: a fireplace, a small kitchen, and enough room for all of us to sleep comfortably. We spent the first evening having fun, drinking, playing cards, and laughing like we hadn't in a long time. The next morning, we woke up feeling a bit groggy but happy. As we were making breakfast, though, something strange happened. Sarah noticed that some of the food we had brought was missing. We had bought enough for the whole weekend, but now a few things were gone. Some bread, a pack of chips, and a bottle of juice. At first, we thought one of us had eaten it late at night, maybe after a few too many drinks, so we laughed it off. But as the day went on, more things started to disappear. By lunch, we realized a flashlight was missing from the kitchen counter. Tom swore he had left it there the night before, but now it was gone. We searched the cabin, thinking maybe it had been moved or knocked off a table, but it was nowhere to be found. That's when Lisa noticed her jacket was missing too. She had left it by the door, but now it was gone. At this point, we were all starting to feel a little uneasy. "Maybe one of you guys is playing a prank," Sarah said, half joking, but none of us were laughing anymore. We searched the cabin again, checking every room, but nothing showed up. There were no signs of anyone breaking in, no broken windows or doors left open. But the missing items made no sense. As the afternoon wore on, the mood grew tense. We tried to keep our spirits up by going for a hike, but the strange feeling lingered. Every time we returned to the cabin, something else seemed to be gone. By the time the sun set, we were all on edge. John had lost his set of keys, and Sarah couldn't find her phone charger. It was getting ridiculous. That night, we sat around the fire, trying to relax, but every little noise outside made us jump. The cabin was old, and it creaked in the wind, which only added to our nerves. Eventually, we decided to search the place one more time. We looked under the beds, in closets, even behind the furniture, and that's when we found it. Behind the pantry, hidden by a stack of old firewood, was a small door. It was low to the ground, almost like a crawl space. None of us had noticed it when we first arrived. Hesitantly, we opened it, and what we found inside chilled us to the bone. It was a small, dark room, barely big enough to stand in. The walls were covered in strange scratches, like someone had been clawing at them. Scattered across the floor were empty food wrappers, clothes, and other belongings that didn't belong to any of us. Some of the missing items from our supplies were there too: Sarah's jacket, Tom's flashlight, and John's keys. It looked like someone had been living there, hiding out in the cabin without us knowing. The thought made my stomach turn. How long had they been watching us? How close had they come while we slept? We locked the door to the room and quickly made plans to leave in the morning. None of us could sleep that night, taking turns keeping watch in case whoever had been staying there returned. Every noise outside felt like a threat, and every shadow seemed like it could be someone sneaking around. At dawn, we packed up and got out of there as fast as we could. But as we were loading the car, I made a chilling discovery. My keys were gone too, even though I had left them in my bag just the night before. We had no choice but to use the spare set and drive away, our hearts pounding the entire ride home. To this day, I still wonder who had been staying in that cabin with us and why they had taken our things. The thought of them watching us, moving around while we slept, still haunts me. I needed a break from everything: the stress of work, the endless noise of the city, and the constant hustle of everyday life. So, I decided to book a cabin in the woods and spend a weekend completely alone. The idea of no people, no phones, and no responsibilities sounded like paradise. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks and was excited to finally have some peace. The drive took a few hours, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already low in the sky. The cabin was small but cozy, surrounded by tall trees and a quiet stillness that was both calming and a little eerie. There was a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a comfortable bed. It was perfect. I unpacked my things, made myself some tea, and settled down with a book. The silence was wonderful, and I felt myself relax for the first time in a long time. As the evening wore on, I stepped outside to watch the last bits of daylight fade behind the trees. The stars were starting to appear, and the air was crisp and cool. It was so quiet that I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I went back inside, locked the door, and decided to spend the rest of the night reading and enjoying the quiet. Around 9 p.m., as I was sitting by the fireplace, I noticed a faint light flickering outside. At first, I thought maybe it was the reflection of the moon through the trees, but it was too bright and too close. I walked over to the window and saw a small light shining in the woods, about 100 yards from the cabin. It looked like a flashlight, and I could just make out a figure standing there, barely visible in the darkness. I told myself it was probably just another camper or hiker, maybe someone who had lost their way. But something about the way they were standing, so still and facing directly towards the cabin, made me uneasy. I turned off the lights inside, hoping they wouldn't see me. I kept watching from the shadows, waiting for them to move on. After a few minutes, the figure started walking closer, their flashlight bobbing up and down as they moved. I could see them more clearly now. A tall person, wrapped in dark clothes, with their face hidden in the shadows. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Why were they coming closer? I hadn't seen any other cabins or signs of people for miles. They must have known I was here, but why hadn't they called out for help if they needed something? I backed away from the window and tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I went to the door, double-checking the lock, and then grabbed a kitchen knife, just in case. I sat down on the floor, hidden behind the couch, and listened. I could hear footsteps now, crunching slowly through the leaves outside. They stopped, then started again, as if the person was circling the cabin. I waited, barely breathing, as the footsteps moved closer to the window. I could see the flashlight beam shining through the curtains, sweeping slowly across the room. I pressed myself lower to the floor, hoping they wouldn't see me. The light stayed there, lingering, and then slowly moved away. For what felt like hours, I sat in complete silence, listening to the footsteps outside. They came and went, sometimes close, sometimes far, but always circling the cabin. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help, and no way to leave until morning. I kept telling myself that they would get bored and go away, that they were just trying to scare me, or maybe they didn't even know I was inside. But as the hours dragged on, I started to feel like they weren't going to leave. They stayed close to the cabin, moving around slowly, almost methodically. I barely slept that night, too scared to close my eyes, afraid that the stranger would find a way inside. Finally, just before dawn, the footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but I heard nothing. Slowly, the first light of day began to creep through the windows. I got up, my body stiff and sore from sitting on the floor all night. I cautiously peeked outside, but there was no one there. The ground around the cabin was covered in fresh footprints, circling around and stopping at each window. It was as if they had been watching me from every angle the entire time. I didn't waste a minute packing my things and getting out of there. I drove back to the city, shaken and exhausted, unable to shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching me all night. Even now, I wonder who it was and what they wanted. And I can't help but think, what would have happened if I hadn't locked that door? It started as a regular hiking trip with my friend, Mark. We'd been talking about it for weeks, eager to get away from the city and enjoy some time in nature. We packed our backpacks with enough food, water, and camping gear for a few days and set out early one Friday morning. The weather was perfect, clear skies and a gentle breeze, making it an ideal day to hike. Everything was going great until we noticed dark clouds forming above us. By late afternoon, those clouds turned into a heavy downpour, and we were caught in the rain with no shelter in sight. We were miles from our base camp, and with the rain pouring down on us, we knew we needed to find shelter fast. That's when we spotted a small, old cabin tucked between the trees. It looked abandoned, with weathered wood and broken windows, but it was dry. We didn't have much of a choice, so we ran over, hoping it would at least keep us out of the rain. The cabin was unlocked, so we went inside. It smelled damp and musty, like it hadn't been used in years. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked with every step. There was an old couch, a small table, and a few chairs that looked like they had been there forever. Despite its age and eerie atmosphere, the cabin felt like a blessing. We set our bags down, relieved to have a roof over our heads. As we started to settle in, I noticed a few strange things. On the table, there was an open can of beans, half-eaten, with a spoon still in it. It looked fresh, not something you'd expect to find in an abandoned cabin. I pointed it out to Mark, who shrugged it off, saying maybe another hiker had come through recently. But I felt uneasy. The idea that someone else might be using this cabin didn't sit right with me, especially with the rain still pouring down outside. The rain continued for hours, so we decided to stay the night. We set up our sleeping bags on the floor, hoping to get some rest before heading back to camp in the morning. We talked for a while, sharing stories and laughing, trying to shake off the strange feeling the cabin gave us. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, I was starting to drift off when I heard the floorboards creak. I opened my eyes, thinking it was just Mark moving around, but he was sound asleep beside me. I lay there, my heart pounding, listening closely. The creaking continued, soft and slow, as if someone was walking around the cabin. I held my breath, afraid to move, and glanced toward the door. That's when I saw a figure standing in the doorway, just staring at us. I could barely make out the outline in the darkness, but I knew someone was there. They didn't say a word, just stood there watching us. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. After a few seconds, which felt like hours, the figure turned and walked away. I didn't dare move until I was sure they were gone. The silence felt heavy, and I lay there, wide awake, until morning. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the walls, I finally felt brave enough to get up. I shook Mark awake, telling him what I had seen, but he just looked at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. We quickly packed our things, ready to leave as soon as possible. But as we gathered our gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the table, scratched into the wood, were the words, "Next time, I won't leave." We grabbed our bags and hurried out of the cabin, not stopping to look back. We practically ran through the forest, the rain-soaked ground squishing under our feet. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. When we finally reached our base camp, we were both out of breath, our nerves frayed. To this day, I still wonder who that person was and what they were doing in that cabin. And I can't help but think about the message they left behind. The idea that someone was watching us, moving around while we slept, makes my skin crawl. I don't think I'll ever go back to that part of the woods again.